Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Article 6 Authorised Carbon Credits, which is hosted by Gold Standard. We're just going to wait maybe one more minute to allow some more people to join and then we're going to get going. But thank you very much to everyone who's joined us today. And I think we'll now get started and we'll allow other people to join as they come through. So for anyone who's joined in the last minute, hello and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Article 6 Authorised Carbon Credits, which is hosted by Gold Standard. My name is Hugh Salway and I am Gold Standard's Senior Director for Market Development and Partnerships. Many of you will have been following the Article 6 negotiations at COP28 last month in December 2023. These negotiations, of course, ended without an adopted decision on Article 6.2, nor a decision on Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. But away from those negotiations, we are seeing progress being made in the real world to implement Article 6. In the last few months, we've seen a growing number of bilateral agreements between countries across the world. We've seen more examples of governments introducing regulations to underpin their use of Article 6. And we've seen the first example of a trade of ITMOs between two governments, between Thailand and Switzerland, which was announced in the last few weeks. We're also starting to see progress under Gold Standard. In November of last year, we announced in Gold Standard that we had labelled the first credits on our registry as authorised for use under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. This was for credits issued to an improved cook stoves programme in Rwanda, which was developed by Atmosfair, the project developer. And it was, as far as we are aware, the first example globally of Article 6 authorised credits issued by a programme like ours. A month later, in December, we labelled a further batch of credits issued to a cook stove programme developed by Hestian Innovation, which is based in Malawi. And we wanted to host today's webinar to share more information for all of you who are joining on these first two examples of Article 6 authorised credits under Gold Standard, as well as to share information on the framework which we have put in place within Gold Standard that both of these projects are using. So we're going to start today with an introduction to the rules and infrastructure that has been put in place in Gold Standard to enable the use of Article 6 by governments and the private sector. And we're then going to hear directly from the two project developers involved in those first examples of labelled authorisations under Gold Standard. We're really pleased to have with us today Florian Eickhold from Atmosfair and Conor from Hestian Innovation. And we're going to spend some time in a panel discussion with both of them later on in this panel, and there'll be time for your questions after that. But before we get to that point, we wanted to start with a basic introduction to Article 6 under Gold Standard. And for some of you out there, I think this will be very familiar, but we're conscious that we have a large audience today, so we wanted to start from a pretty basic level to understand why Gold Standard is thinking about Article 6, what we've put in place, and how it can support project impact across the world. So we move on a couple of slides, please. And I wanted to say, while the slides are moving on, I believe there's a Q&A feature for this webinar. So if you do have any questions, either for Gold Standard or for our panelists who are joining us later, please do write those into the question and answer section, and we'll try to answer as many as possible during this session. So reflecting a little bit about Article 6 under Gold Standard. At the heart of Article 6, for everyone who knows this, are ITMOs, Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcomes. In most cases, these ITMOs will be verified emission reduction or removal units achieved in one country. And what Article 6 does is it says that the government of that host country can agree that another government or another private entity can use those verified emission reductions or removals towards its own NDC or its own target. And that host country, that host government, agrees that it won't count those same emissions impacts towards its own NDC. And it will do this by applying essentially an accounting correction when reporting to the UNFCCC, what's known as a corresponding adjustment. And this mechanism for allowing impact achieved in one country to be used by other countries or private entities is really a route to allow the world community to be able to achieve global net zero in a more cost-effective way, realising emissions impacts where they can be achieved in a more realisable, cost-effective way. Central to Article 6 is, of course, governments, the governments that authorise emission reductions or removals for use under Article 6, as well as those that buy them. But there's also an important role for standard setters like us, like Gold Standard. And that role, as we see it, is to provide high standards for the generation of emissions reductions or removals, to provide a process for certifying them and making sure these reductions, removals happened in reality, and to provide a recognised label and asset that can support market transactions. That work can be done by governments, and there are some governments who are looking to do exactly that. So when you look at the examples of bilateral agreements by Switzerland, they're looking to provide certification through their own systems and their own bilateral agreements. But there are other governments across the world for whom the administrative costs of running certification of projects, working with third-party verifiers, establishing standards are too high. And it's possible also that some of those routes may not have the same value, credibility that could be achieved through gold standard certification, which has been built up over the last 20 years. And so in the past few years, we've seen governments across the world starting to recognise gold standard as a certifier of the emission reductions or removals that they plan to use or to authorise under Article 6. As an example of this, 2 years ago, the government of Singapore recognised gold standard alongside several other standards as an eligible standard to provide carbon credits that could be used under their carbon tax and then ultimately used by the government towards their NDC. Gold standard's also been recognised as an eligible crediting programme under CORSIA, the international aviation sector's offsetting scheme. Under the first phase of this scheme, which started just a few weeks ago, and on which gold standard is still waiting for our eligibility approval, only credits that are authorised for use under Article 6 can be used by airlines. And this is an important step change from the pilot phase, which took place over the past few years. Moving into this new compliance phase, not only is it mandatory for all airlines in participating countries, but also airlines will only be able to use Article 6 authorised credits that won't be counted towards the NDC of a particular country. And this marks a big step change for CORSIA, and it's a market that we are looking to enable under gold standard. And alongside these two more compliance use cases, so use towards NDCs and use under CORSIA, we're starting to see demand from the voluntary carbon market for Article 6 units by companies who want to secure unique claims to the emission reductions or removals that they use when making public claims about their corporate responsibility. So we have several growing markets for Article 6 units, use towards NDC, use in CORSIA, and use in the voluntary carbon market. And in gold standard, we see ourselves playing a role enabling all of those markets to operate. And that role is really to be enabler for governments which want to use ITMOs, use credits towards their targets, for governments that want to authorise mitigation outcomes within their jurisdiction, and for project developers, for the private sector who want to invest in projects that deliver impact and to use Article 6 as a route for carbon finance. In the next slide, we're going to start to look at what we've put in place in gold standard over the past few years to enable this. And this is before we go on to the panel which comes afterwards, where we hear from some of the first projects which have used this framework. So we click on one more time. There are really four areas to the work which we've done in gold standard in order to enable Article 6 use through our standard. The first of these is the introduction of new requirements. So going back to 2022, gold standard introduced new requirements into our rules for the labelling of credits as Article 6 authorised. So if a project receives a letter of authorisation from a host country, our requirements set out several important restrictions, requirements, and rules for how these are managed. These requirements, firstly, set out the information which we need to see in an Article 6 letter of authorisation to make sure that that letter is compliant with the UNFCCC's requirements. Our requirements secondly set out how we'll track the application of corresponding adjustments and how we'll report to governments on activity related to Article 6 credits in our registry. And then thirdly, and importantly, these requirements set out how we'll manage any instances where a government might revoke its authorisation and where it might not apply a corresponding adjustment that it's committed to. This was one of the big issues in the Article 6 negotiations in December last month, whether governments can revoke or pull back on authorisations that they've given. And it's something which we are looking to make sure that we can manage in our standard if we do have instances of this. And it's important to say that the requirements that we've put in place will, of course, be updated if we see new decisions which come through from the UNFCCC. What we're looking to do in Gold Standard is to make sure that we provide a route for project developers, for governments seeking to use Article 6 that is compliant with UNFCCC decisions. If we go on one more, please. The second important thing that we've introduced in Gold Standard in the past few years is new functionality in our registry, which allows us to label credits that have received a letter of authorization from their host country, as well as a separate label that allows us to show when a credit has been correspondingly adjusted. That is when the government has applied its accounting adjustment when reporting to the UNFCCC. And it's important to say on this that, and I'll come on to this in a second, we don't just have one label. You won't go onto our registry and just see a tick for Article 6 authorization. Under the rules of Article 6, governments are able to authorize ITMOs to authorize these emission reductions for different use cases. They can be authorized for use towards NDCs, authorized for use towards international mitigation purposes, an example of which is CORSIA, and authorized for use towards other purposes, which could include their use in the voluntary carbon market. And in our registry, we've created a framework which means that we can label correctly which use cases credits are being authorized for, and we can manage the use of these credits to make sure that they cannot be retired for purposes that goes outside of those authorized use cases. And that's really to make sure in Gold Standard that we respect the authorization of a government and we don't allow the credits to be used for purposes that weren't intended by the government in the first place. Another important thing to say on registry is we're looking at how our registry in Gold Standard works with any new registries that national governments will be setting up to manage the use of Article 6. We're looking initially at what can be done through information transfers offline, but ultimately we would like to move to a place where we have digital connections between different registries to make sure that information can be shared in real time between them. And if we click on, please. This shows you what our registry looks like for Article 6 authorised credits. If you go into our registry, as some of you may have done, you're able now to filter for Article 6 authorised credits if looking at the credit issuances page. And if we click on one more time, you can see here on the right-hand side the different possible host country authorizations under Article 6. So you can see whether credits have been authorized for compliance, which is the language which we use in our registry for NDC use, whether they have been authorized for use under CORSIA, the aviation offsetting scheme, and whether they've been authorized for other purposes as well. You can also see if we click on whether the credits are eligible for use in CORSIA, and we will in the next few months be differentiating in our registry so that you can see whether credits are eligible under the initial voluntary phase of CORSIA or whether they are eligible under this first phase, which we're entering into now, because the eligibility for both different phases is different. And then finally, on the left-hand side, if we click on, you can see whether the host government has applied a corresponding adjustment. And for those of you who know Article 6 well, you'll know that there will typically be a time lag between the authorization of credits and the government applying a corresponding adjustment. And this is something that we wanted to make very clear in our registry, so you can see very clearly whether credits have received this letter of authorization, and then separately whether the government has yet applied the corresponding adjustment. And in our requirements, which I mentioned earlier, we set out the process for how we will manage and monitor the application of corresponding adjustments by host countries. If we go on to the next slide, and click on one more time, you'll see that if you go into the kind of credit page for particular credit batches within our registry, you can also see at that level where credits have received a letter of authorization by the host country and whether a corresponding adjustment has been applied. And what we don't show here, but is also important to be aware of, whenever a letter of authorization has been provided by a host country and meets our requirements and meets the requirements of the UNFCCC guidance, we will include that letter within the project certification documents. So if you go into the project certification documents, you will be able to see the original letter of authorization, as well as a checklist provided by the project developer themselves. And if we go on one more slide, the third important element of work which we are doing under Gold Standard in order to make Article 6 a reality through our standard is looking at rule alignment. So Gold Standard has taken a lot of lessons and a lot of our framework in the past from the Clean Development Mechanism. We were established initially as a label on the Clean Development Mechanism, and a lot of the principles underlying our standard have been drawn from that mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. We're now entering into the Paris context, into the Article 6 context. And as we've been communicating for several years now, we're looking at where our rules will need to align with new norms, new best practice, which is adopted under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. And that may mean changes in some areas to how our rules are set up at the moment. This work clearly wasn't helped by the fact that governments weren't able to agree a decision on Article 6.4 at the most recent COP, but it's still part of our plans over the years ahead. And if we click on one more time, a really important part of making Article 6 implementation a reality under our standard is the relationship that we have with DNAs, with the designated national authorities of the governments with which we work and which authorise credits under Gold Standard. And so there are preparations which we're making now for how exactly we will work and our administrators will work with the registry administrators of governments which provide letters of authorization, and what norms we'll put in place to make sure that we're reporting information to governments so that they are able to report correctly to the UNFCCC on their use of Article 6. And some of you may have seen that at COP28, in the final few days of COP28, Gold Standard, alongside Vera and the National Climate Change Secretariat of Singapore, announced an initiative to develop what we called a playbook for making Article 6 operational. And what that playbook is really trying to do is to create a standard operating procedure for how governments and crediting programs like ours should work together, where credits are authorised by governments under Article 6 and are registered and certified under a crediting programme. And what we want to do through that programme of work is make sure that we avoid a situation in the future where 100 governments adopt different ideas of how they should work with different standards, and each of the different standard setters also has different ideas of how they should work with governments. What we're trying to do is to create a more harmonised approach to how Article 6 works when credits are authorised under crediting programmes like ours and like Vera's. So there's a lot of work which is going on already in Gold Standard to make Article 6 operational. And what's very exciting is that we now have the first examples of projects which are certified under Gold Standard and which have received letters of authorization from host countries. I think the outcome of COP28 was a real blow for implementation of Article 6. But I think we can take heart from the fact that we are seeing examples of governments willing to provide letters of authorizations to projects. And we're seeing examples of project developers working constructively with the government to look at how they can implement activities which deliver impact on the ground and also help the country to go beyond what would be achieved under their NDC. And I'm going to pass over now to my colleague, Kavya Bajaj, Gold Standard's Government Relations Manager, who's going to lead a panel discussion with the two project developers involved in these first projects. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh. On to the next slide, please. So, as Hugh mentioned, today's session reflects on the development of guidance and regulation under Article 6 to not only help others taking action under Article 6, but also support all key stakeholders of the ecosystem. But this is focusing, this session and this webinar is largely focusing mainly on Article 6 authorization and the first experiences within that. So, just repeating a couple of points where that Hugh has already mentioned, Gold Standard has taken initiative to align overall with Article 6 and introduced functionalities and systems to manage Article 6 authorizations, which we just saw. We've applied these systems to the first examples of Article 6 authorizations initiated by two project developers that we have here with us, Atmosphere and Hestian, first in Rwanda and then in Malawi. For today's great panel, as already you can see on screen, we have Florian Eickhold, who is a climate finance and environmental markets expert at Atmosphere, and Conor, who is the director at Hestian Innovation Limited. So Atmosfair is a German nonprofit organization that actively contributes to carbon dioxide mitigation by promoting, developing, and financing renewable energies in over 20 countries worldwide. Atmosfair was the first project developer to receive Article 6 authorization for credits in November last year for transformative clean cooking projects based in Rwanda and registered with Gold Standard. Conor from Hestian, and Hestian is a project developer focusing on fuel efficiency projects in Malawi and Rwanda with the objective of reducing negative health and environmental impacts of solid fuel consumption. Hestian is the second project developer to receive Article 6 authorization for credits in December last month, in fact, also under clean cooking projects based in Malawi, again registered with Gold Standard. So I'm going to turn to the panel and ask some questions that will last about 25 to 30 minutes. But after that, we'll turn to the questions that are already coming up in the Q&A function. So anytime from now, please feel free to write out your questions that you might have in the Q&A function on Teams. You'll have an option to see on the Teams window where you have an option for more. And within that, you can press Q&A and you can ask questions right on over there. Please feel free to ask questions that are general questions or specific questions to particular panelists, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can in the time that we have. So now I turn over the panel, and they have a couple of slides already, but maybe we can start with a couple of introductory remarks from Florian, and then we go on to Conor. Florian, if you're able to share your screen.
Okay. Can you see my screen, Kavya?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Yeah.
We're going to be sharing your slide just now.
Yeah. Is it visible now, my screen?
Just give us a couple of seconds. Your screen is not visible yet, but it's going to be up just in a couple of seconds. Your slides.
Okay.
So your presentation is up now.
Okay. Okay, yeah, thanks again for inviting Atmosfair to this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks a lot for the introductory remarks that gave a brilliant summary of where we are at the moment, I guess. So I would like to briefly introduce Atmosfair, what we are doing in Rwanda, and some of the remarks how we use the current framework provided by Gold Standard. Atmosfair, as already mentioned, is a not-for-profit company working on the implementation of the global just energy transition. We are channeling private sector funds into climate action projects. And in Rwanda, one of our very important lighthouse projects works with highly efficient biomass-fired cook stoves. As you see on the picture on the left side, a woman with her family cooking. And these are high-quality stoves with a 10-year guarantee. And actually, we started this project assembling the stoves in Germany, then shipping them over to Rwanda. But now, in 2022, we shifted the whole production of these stoves to Rwanda, and that was a major milestone that also contributed to the authorization. And yeah, as you see here on the left-hand side, women working in the factory, in the brand new factory in Rwanda. And the authorization for our project team was a major milestone, a very important milestone, because together with our partner Safer Rwanda and Safer One Limited, Rwanda Women Network, UNHCR, we have impacted over now 10 years the livelihoods in Rwanda providing these stoves. And the authorization was a major milestone because it assures the financial flows also into this project and gives certainty for planning. But what does authorization mean, and why do we need this authorization? It is a tool for us to raise ambition. The private sector can help to raise global ambition through voluntary cancellation of these authorized units, because these units, as used for other purposes in the voluntary carbon market, are cancelled and though not available anymore to any other compliance scheme. So very ambitious companies that want to take action apart from their own high ambition reduction pathway under the science-based targets, they can buy these units and voluntarily cancel them. And the authorization of gold standard VRs is a very important step of the implementation of a Paris-aligned carbon market. It is a Paris-aligned premium product that can now be offered, and that's why it is so important also to bring this into the market, that these products are now available. There are very few of them, but it's still possible to work in this direction. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Florian. Thanks for the good introduction, and also to the introduction on why you pursued authorization. I hope you can speak more to this in the next couple of questions that I will be asking. But for now, over to Conor from Hestian, who will be introducing Hestian just a bit. And then we'll move on to questions from there.
Thank you, Kavya.
We're just taking a couple of seconds to put up your slides. But as we, so your slide is up now, and please do go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Kavya. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, but it's a bit dim, so I would urge you to speak a little louder.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay, okay, thanks very much to Kavya and the Gold Standard for inviting us on to this webinar, and it's a great pleasure. We are very happy to have received a letter of authorization from the government of Malawi, and this was enabled by the Gold Standard, as it was new for all parties involved, I think. Just a little background on Hestian Innovation Limited. We have been working in Malawi developing gold standards programs for cleaner cooking since 2008, and we have during that time promoted locally made technologies, and we focused in on specifically on a locally made cleaner cook stove, and have focused on reaching mainly the rural population that depends on firewood for their everyday cooking needs. And, you know, so that has brings about a lot of sustainable development benefits, as probably many of the project developers who are on this webinar will know and be well aware of. I guess just to say that the letter of authorization, how did that come about? Well, it was mainly driven by demand from the market. So it became evident that the market wanted credits that they were called Article 6 authorised credits, or corresponding adjustment credits. And so then we approached the government of Malawi, who had recently set up under His Excellency President Chakwera, voluntary Malawi Carbon Market Initiative in July 23. So there was a good enabling environment in Malawi, and yes, as I mentioned already, that the gold standard helps to enable this process. And I guess we were the main attraction, as Hugh pointed out earlier, is access to new markets such as Corsia. So that's a background on Hestian. Look forward to questions from Kavya, and if there's any questions from the participants on the webinar afterwards, we'd be more than willing to engage. Thanks very much, Kavya.
Thank you so much, Florian. Sorry, Conor. Thank you so much, Conor, for introducing Hestian and giving that brief background on the project so far. And as we move on to questions, I will be asking questions on the motivations for pursuing authorization, which have been sort of alluded to by the speakers already, and also on their experiences engaging with the regulation so far, and as well as engaging with other stakeholders in the ecosystem. So the first question to both panelists is, as project developers, why did you choose to seek authorization for under Article 6 for your project, bearing in mind that the credits are not currently planned to be used by another country under the NEC yet? Florian, since you are from Atmosfair, which is the first project developer to receive authorization under Article 6, maybe you could speak to this question first, and then we'll move on to Conor to hear his perspective as well.
Yes, thanks for this question. So I think the first element to answer here is our projects, the Atmosfair projects, are mostly CDM and gold standard certified, plus own criteria Atmosfair applies to these projects. So our projects historically are known by the governments because they have already a letter of approval under the CDM. And our original plan is to maintain this multilateral oversight for the project that is offered, was offered by the CDM, and is offered now potentially by the 6.4 mechanism. So that was the first, let's say, technical motivation why we are seeking this authorization. So it is a prerequisite to enter the 6.4 mechanism, and therefore we needed the authorization in the first step. The second is the opportunity that offers the voluntary cancellation, as I mentioned, for the private sector. The private sector now can use authorized credits for their purposes and associated claims. And there is, as Conor also mentioned, a demand for these units. And as Atmosfair is known as a premium project developers, also we have been approached by companies looking for the best option to act in the voluntary carbon market. And one of these options is the cancellation of authorized units. So there's two elements, let's say a technical motivation and then a market motivation.
Thank you so much, Florian. Moving on to Conor. Conor, the same question goes out to you, but just to repeat, what is your motivation to pursue authorization under Article 6 for your project?
Thanks, Kavya. The number one main reason for seeking Article 6 authorization is, without any doubt, is responding to the demands of the market. So we have lots of credits, and with Article 6 authorization, they become attractive for buyers. Once gold standard is fully approved by Eickhold, our credits can qualify for Phase 1 CORSIA. And also, as an interim measure, can meet the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative's claims code of practice. So I guess to conclude, or just to summarize, in my perspective, the main driver for Article 6 authorization is to access new markets.
Thank you very much, Florian. I mean, Conor, I'm so sorry to misspeak your name once more, but I see Florian's name right on screen, which is why I've made the mistake. But thank you so much, Conor. And just to reiterate what you just said, it is more attractive largely to access the market, and it's more attractive and also to align with VCMI claims code of practice. So thank you so much, Conor, for that. Just moving on to the second question now. Based on this first experience, what are the key steps that a government can take to provide certainty for those seeking to develop Article 6 projects in their jurisdiction? Maybe this time we can start with Conor.
Sure. Thanks, Kavya. Yeah, so I think that the steps per se are not so important. So that it's not so much about the process, it's about being open to make it happen. In other words, there's a saying that if there is a will, there is a way. And our experience with Malawi was one of trust, and we made it happen together. With help, as I mentioned, from the gold standard, who enables this process. So the Malawi government was very clear from the start that they were open to facilitating a letter of authorization. And so there was this enabling environment that was helped by the Malawi Carbon Market Initiative that I mentioned earlier. I also worked very closely with the government of Malawi's participation in the United Nations High-Level Dialogue for Energy in 2021, where His Excellency Chakwera was the first head of state that dedicated a speech exclusively to cleaner cooking at the UN, resulting in the launch of Malawi's Cleaner Cooking Energy Compact, committing to universal access to cleaner cooking by 2030. So I guess that what really helped the process from our perspective was the trust that we built with each other, with the government of Malawi and also the gold standard to make it happen. And we didn't all understand the process, but because there was trust and a good vibe, so to speak, it happened, and it took some weeks to with all the clarifications back and forth, but yeah, that's how. So it's not so much about a step step-by-step process. In my perspective, it's more about having this understanding and trust to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Conor. So I see that you said that there's two main things over here. One is an enabling environment that the government provides through maybe guidance or processes. And secondly, it's the development of trust, the trust between a project developer and the government. So just on your second point, before we move on to Florian to answer the same question, but just on your second point on building trust, for project developers who are coming in, who are new to the process, how do you suggest they could build more trust with governments?
I think being open and transparent and you know, I guess there's a level of honesty that nobody really knows how this process is going to evolve, and but that if you're willing, if you'd like to see these projects work in your country as government, and we would like to see them prosper, that you know, we can create value for everybody here. We can add value at all the different levels together, and so there's potential for a win-win scenario, you know. And what we're doing is in facilitating investment for you know, the green economy, the circular economy, and that is attractive, I think, for almost all governments. So yeah, I think honesty and openness and transparency, I think, is good for building trust, building a good working relationship.
Thank you, Conor. Yes, I think we all agree that honesty and transparency is key to building trust, both from the project developer side as well as the governments, as well as coming together and supporting each other through platforms and forums that already exist for project developers, for example. So now moving on to Florian with the question that I asked Conor before. Based on this first experience, what are the key steps that a government can take to provide certainty for those seeking to develop Article 6 projects in their jurisdiction? Florian, over to you.
Yeah, first, I think it is worthwhile mentioning that the participation in Article 6 or authorization is voluntary. So no government must have the mechanism in place to do this. It's a voluntary decision. But if a government wants to go into this process, I think there are three important elements of readiness. There is, let's say, the political readiness, that is more the willingness to participate in this sector and to engage with collaboration with private sector. And then there is the legal readiness level, so having all the procedures and legal requirements in place to channel such an authorization. And there is the technical process. How do you work with the registry, etc. So there's a technical readiness, and all these levels have to be progress. And then I think what would be very interesting would be let's say an analysis of governments where they see potential private sector investment through the voluntary carbon market, in which sectors. And then putting that forward as a potential offer to the private sector to make investments there. Proactively pointing to the high-hanging fruit projects they want to see financed by the private sector. So that would facilitate a lot the identification of projects and then further on the authorization process. And of course, it is. I agree on the trust building process before such a authorization, And one of the elements is that project developers must take some risks at that point in time. Now they have to show to the government that they are really willing to upfront invest in climate action. So and that facilitates a lot then the process of authorization.
Thanks so much, Florian. These are some really useful points on, especially on the 3 points that governments can action to show readiness and show in signal that they are ready to engage with project developers and other stakeholders in the environment. And we also see now with governments who are coming up with similar positive lists, as you mentioned, on sectors that would be sectors that they are wanting to attract more investments into. I hope these sort of examples are adopted by other governments, and governments are able to signal more what is needed to other project developers. The last point that you mentioned on project developers taking some, showing that they're willing to take on some risk and showing that they're willing to make upfront investments. On that point, not all project developers may be ready to do that. So do you think there are other avenues that project developers could engage in to show this willingness of upfront investment?
Yes, the dialogue, of course, this desired readiness level I just mentioned or summarized is not there yet in many countries, and the dialogue with the government, early dialogue with the government about what should be done and what stages, developing a plan, stepwise plan to implement the project that could be a less risky project. Also de-risking projects. There are tools to de-risk projects, for example, asking governments a letter of no objection, or generally express the willingness to collaborate under the voluntary carbon market. And through this dialogue with the government, then project developers could find out whether an investment can be done. But there must be at a certain point, there must be a step forward by the project developer, and but the dialogue, of course, helps to de-risk the decision.
Well noted on that point on dialogue and other tools that can be accessed to show willingness and to de-risk projects. So moving on to the next question, and this time, Florian, you can go first. So moving on to the next question, how important or not is the fact that governments did not agree on a decision for Article 6.2 and 6.4 during COP? What are your thoughts on that, Florian?
Yes, I think for me it was a big disappointment that all the work that the 6.4 supervisory body that has been put forward to the CMA at this COP was not adopted, and there was no progress made. So now we have still a long way to go until the 6.4 mechanism is operational, and it was a disappointment also because I expect from the 6.4 mechanism a lot of guidance for the voluntary carbon market. And but luckily, I mean, we all know the UN process and its risks. So luckily, we prepared for that with a fallback option, and I think the gold standards transition framework is a very well placed tool in order to bridge this gap until the 6.4 mechanism will be operational. So for now, I think the gold standard VR with authorization is a very good product until the 6.4 mechanism is available and operational.
Thank you, Florian. Moving on to Conor for your thoughts on the same question, on the lack of agreement on Article 6.2 and 6.4. Conor.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Florian said there, and it's we urgently need a post CDM 6 mechanism to bridge the gaps in finance, and yeah, in the meantime, I guess there is an opportunity to demonstrate that the Article 6 authorised programmes, for us to demonstrate how to maximise value to all the stakeholders involved in a way that hasn't happened to date, so that countries like Malawi can really benefit from the carbon market at all levels, from households, communities, social enterprises, entire sectors, and government. So that's my take on the development of COP28.
Thank you so much, Conor and Florian. I also just wanted to ask a last question before we move on to the questions that are on the Q&A in the Teams function, which Conor and Florian, you both can look into and answer to as well as us as we man the questions. Just moving on to the last question to the panel. So based on your experience and also maybe on your wider understanding, what key attributes do you believe governments are looking for in projects seeking authorization under Article 6 within their jurisdiction? And have the governments that you have engaged with or outside of that shown indication to release this in the form of guidance? Florian or Conor, either of you can take this, but maybe Conor, if you'd like to go first, please do.
Yeah, I would imagine that a main attraction for governments would be scale and impact. So that a lot of people can benefit from the cleaner technologies or the program in question, and so the scale that a lot of people and the impact that it benefits people and communities, and I guess if there's a share of proceeds to government, they'd also have an interest in the scale of the number of credits.
Thanks, Conor. Just repeating your points. So you believe that the main attraction for governments is scale and impact, the impact it can achieve in their jurisdiction on the people, on the communities, and also share of proceeds could be leveraged for the scale and impact. Florian, moving on to you with the same question, based on your experience and maybe on your wider understanding, what do you think governments are looking for in projects when they're giving out authorization? And are they inclined to release guidance on this based on your interactions?
Well, the most important element is that from a mitigation point of view, that the projects are aligned with the long-term strategy and suits well into the finance strategy of the NDC and long-term strategy implementation. So there must be a space, and everybody, so these documents are publicly available from most of the countries, and project developers can look through these documents, identifying strategic aspects of mitigation. Of course, then there's not a potential project list in these documents, but dialogue with the government then could facilitate where private sector investments would be welcome. And there are, unfortunately, I haven't seen so many direct publications from governments that invite a private sector to invest in certain specific technologies, but these documents, or at least, for example, India had provided a green list of projects, a positive list, but other countries they are still working on it. And one of the real important elements is that the project contributes to well-being and social economic development in the countries. Jobs are the factory we built in Rwanda, creating 300 jobs. That was really important and a major element of that was considered for the authorization.
Thanks, Florian. That is really useful. Scanning and analyzing the strategies of the government and seeing what their developmental objectives are and aligning with that and making sure your project delivers those kind of outcomes. That is a really important takeaway. So just looking at questions on the chat already. I'm sure Florian and Conor, you've both seen these questions on the chat. I'm going through a couple of questions myself. And Florian, there's a question directed at you most recently. You mentioned a premium Paris-aligned product. How does this premium affect the methodological and MRV approach? And how do you address overcrediting risks originating from FNRB estimates?
Yes, well, Paris alignment, of course, does not mean only authorization. It also needs to build on the lessons learned from the CDM, and methodologies are evolving over time, and projects need also to adopt the new methodologies. That was one of the guidance I expected from the 6.4 mechanism to release new approved methodologies also on the cooked stove technologies with an adjusted and better suitable FNRB, so that we can make sure that no overcrediting occurs, and that the mitigation outcomes validated in these projects are real.
Thank you, Florian, for that succinct answer. I hope that addressed the question on the chat. We're almost at time, just because we started a couple of minutes late, and also the discussion was it took a long time. We will be answering a couple of questions on chat, and just to direct a question to both you, Florian, and Conor, because this is a general one, but a one that is quite sought after. How long did it take in entirety for project development, certification, and obtaining Article 6 authorization? I guess we're all familiar with the certification cycle, but just the addition of authorization adds elements of uncertainty. So just maybe if you could briefly speak to that question on the timing of authorization. Maybe Conor, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. I see on the chat that some people can't hear me, so I'll speak up, try to speak a bit louder. We engaged initially with the government of Malawi in July, and we eventually got the final, all the clarifications were clarified by the start of December. So that's about 4 months, I guess. And during that time there was a bit of back and forth. But yeah, I would imagine it would take 3 to 4 months at least. But presumably when there's more experience, that could be less.
Thanks. Florian, the same question to you.
Yes. Well, I think Conor's example is a very positive example where it took less time. We started, I think, in 2018 or something like that to discuss with governments what authorization would mean, and it was totally unknown at that time. What would that mean for the market? How would it look like? So at that time, it was really a lengthy process with a lot of workshops, trying to figure out what to do. But now, as readiness levels are increasing, the time should be potentially shortened. Also, it depends whether a government has all mechanisms in place to give this authorization. So I think a dialogue should be started very early with the government to assure that you're not going into a direction that is not suitable. But then the authorization process could be could last a few months. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Florian. Yes, it's already quite positive to see that with the second example with Hestian, it took about 4 to 5 months already to get authorization, while for atmosfair, it took a bit longer, a couple of years. And it really depends on the kind of country you're engaging with, in the sense that have they engaged with authorization before or not? Do they have guidances in place or not? As Florian just mentioned, starting dialogue early with governments, engaging with the authorization process for the first time, that is quite a good suggestion and takeaway to go away with. Just because we're a couple of minutes over time already, we do have your questions in place and we hope to answer some of them on chat. But maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll move to the closing of the session. Considering the authorization is an administrative process that requires legal backing, and that both Malawi and Rwanda do not yet have the legal frameworks of Article 6 process, on what legal basis were authorizations to atmosfair and Hestian issued? Maybe Florian, you could speak to this first. This is a question from Lydia Omukujung.
Yeah, well, the entity handing out this authorization is the Rwandan DNA, and there are procedures in place. I know this entity aligns and aligns with other ministries and on this authorization, so that the government is standing behind this authorization as a whole.
Thanks, Florian. Conor, over to you.
Yeah, I can't speak on behalf of the government of Malawi, so I'm not sure the workings that went on to make the letter of authorization happen. But there was, as I mentioned, there was a very there was an openness from the get-go to make it happen, and you know, from our perspective as a project developer, it was a productive, constructive process.
Thank you, Conor. And to those who weren't able to hear Conor, it was the initiative from governments, the openness by the government to authorize a project. So he can't speak for the government of Malawi, but it was mainly and largely the openness and willingness for the government to engage in the authorization process. So thanks for that, Conor. With that last question, I am going to go to the closing of the webinar. Thank you so much to the panel today, and thank you so much for providing your insights on the first examples of authorization, both to Conor and Florian. They were really, really insightful, and hopefully these can be steps forward for other project developers and other stakeholders in the ecosystem to engage in the authorization process better. And as we see, there is a positive movement already, with the first authorization process taking a lot more time and work and engagement. And as more and more authorization examples come into the process becoming simpler and more easier to engage. And we hope that this will be quite a straightforward process with the guidances, not only with the guidances that come up from government standpoint, but also from the other examples that we can learn from in the entire ecosystem. This also highlights what we have been discussing so far in our last webinar series on the Early Mover Program, a program that we just concluded earlier last year, where we talk about first mover examples of Article 6 implementation. And now that we see that Article 6 authorization examples are now in place, we see us moving closer and closer to the goal of shared knowledge, shared experiences, and implementation of Article 6, supporting all key stakeholders in the ecosystem, and further inform models for market-based cooperation to scale up, importantly, finance and integrity under the Paris Agreement. So before I close the session, I also want to thank the audience for all of your questions, and also want to introduce a webinar series that we are launching. If you could share the slides once more and go on to the last slide, Camille. In the meantime, the slides are coming up. I do want to just take a moment to share the Abatable webinar series. We've partnered with Abatable, a data management platform, to launch a series of webinars where we will be sharing unique insights, experiences, and best practices on national carbon market policies, with policymakers and experts discussing new regulatory developments and Article 6 agreements across the world. So our first webinar, which is going to be launched and held on 16th February next month, will be on the interplay between CORSIA and Article 6. CORSIA has now entered phase 1 of its implementation, making a lot of things come into place, like Article 6 authorized credits being used under the first phase. So in this webinar, we aim to have an interactive discussion on how we can navigate challenges associated with authorizations for use of credits under CORSIA, and also offer insights on how to successfully adapt to these needs. So do come on, do register. Our registrations are open already and already on the Abatable website. If you just search it on Google, you will find it, and I urge you to register and come in for that webinar. With that, I close the session. Thank you so much for attending in such a huge number. Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you again to the panelists for your invaluable insights on the first examples of authorization. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be put up on our website for everyone to watch again, in case you would like to. Just wanted to reiterate that, and thank you again. Goodbye.